Hello and welcome to this very special broadcast that we're bringing to you from the Synergia Conclave in Bangalore in collaboration with Times Now. And to talk to us today, we have a very, very special guest who's come all the way from Israel. Joining us is Doron Avital, who's a former commander of the Sayeret Matkal, or the Special Forces of Israel, to help us better understand what's actually happening as far as the ground offensive is concerned. He's also a former member of the Knesset, or the Parliament of Israel. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Also with us on this broadcast is the founder and president of Synergia, Tobby. Thanks so much, Tobby, for joining us as well. Let me begin with you, sir, Mr. Avital. And let's start with a question that many of us were found asking ourselves on the 7th of October. Israel has some of the best special forces, some of the best intelligence of the world. And yet, when it happened on the 7th of October, there were many questions asked as to how it could happen. Was it a failure of human intelligence? Was there over-reliance on tech, for instance? Was it that the underground tunnels were so extensively used that it was undetected? 40 days later, are we any the wiser as to how such a big intelligence failure happened?
It was a terrible intelligence failure to begin with, a failure of our intelligence command, a failure of our internal security, what we call the Shabak. A terrible failure in terms of understanding the intentions of the enemy, because we did know that they are conducting this exercise, but we didn't interpret it in terms of an attack that is coming very soon. And of course, it took us a day or two to overcome this invasion. A lot of gallantry. Soldiers came from their homes, driving their cars, entering into the battlefield, pushing the enemy to the borders. But it's something that we'll have to investigate. How did it happen? Reliance on tech, for sure, it's a big part of the issue. Not having enough human intelligence from Gaza. And a decoy. Our attention was in the West Bank and in the North, and we really felt that we have an airtight defense over Gaza. That everything is controlled and commanded, tech controlled and so on. So never think in terms of airtight defense. This is one of our greatest mistakes. We would learn the lesson and we'll be back on track.
But as a democratic country, as an open democracy with citizens already asking these questions, do you believe that there will be accountability for what has happened?
There's no question that there will be an investigation and a committee. We had such a setback back then in the Yom Kippur War in '73, and there was a famous committee after which the whole political chain has changed. Golda Meir lost her position, Yitzhak Rabin got into position, and then later the Likud went to power. So there would be investigation. There's no question that the people in the intelligence and in the army command that right now lead the war, but they will have to take accountability over those failures, and I think they already professed this. They actually said it. The issue, of course, like always in every country, is the political eshkelon. And the political eshkelon will try to play its cards, specifically Bibi Netanyahu. But my estimate that a failure in this magnitude cannot stop without hitting the political eshkelon. So there would be far-reaching consequences politically.
Because it's not just about intelligence. We're also talking about a situation where the kibbutz Reem, the supernova, was hit at about 8 a.m. in the morning. Yeah, exactly. But when we look at the reports of when the rescue efforts actually happened, they were 5 hours later. Yeah, so that's really something that we're talking about, a delayed response.
The second failure is the operational level. I'm telling you, we had I'm not sure how many regiments employed in the West Bank, and we felt so confident with this airtight defense, this mechanism of sensors and fences, and we always felt only in terms of missile attacks. So we have the Iron Dome, which gives us a sort of a defense. So the deployment of the forces, it took some time, and to get the picture, it took some time. This is why initiative on the ground, police, special forces of the army, paratroopers, deciding on their own to take 4 helicopters and in 8, 9 in the morning be there. And individuals, civilians, taking a gun and fighting, this what made the day. It took us a day or two to get back on track. But it's true, operational failure, surely. This is also something that will have to be investigated.
Right. Tobby, what would you say are the learning lessons for India, which is also a country that deals with terror of different hues? It's not just terror emanating from Pakistan. We have our own left-wing extremist terror. There is a K threat that has started to sort of rear its ugly head now. And of course, in Canada, we are seeing what's happening. In terms of our own intelligence, is there a lot to learn from what Israel has recently gone through?
Yeah, thanks, Madhav. I think there are more than 2 or 3 lessons that we have to learn. One, there is nothing that, as Doron said, a fully watertight security. People can pick holes, and these are days of asymmetric war. My larger point is that the difference between super brilliant, good, is at best 0.5, 1%. That's it. Even in an examination, it's the 99.5% who gets selected. Now the challenge is, if you have a fractured country, okay, and if people are taking the eyes off the ball, even for a few minutes, that is the gap people will look for. So to me, the biggest weakness that happened in Israel was not that the intelligence was bad or the security forces were not good. No, they're brilliant. But their commitment to the cause, because they were protesting on the streets. Now the lesson for India is, whatever we say, we should make sure that whatever we have internally is controlled.
And does not impact externally.
Yeah. Because you see what happens today in the diaspora. They were Indians before. 25, 30, 40 years ago, when you talk about the Canadian problem, most of them were Indians who were living in Punjab.
Right.
And then they went out, and in 30, 40 years, there's no more Indians. But actually they're Indians.
Right.
But they bear a grudge, which they feel, there was injustice meted out to them 40 years ago. And they're not forgiving us for that.
Exactly.
Right.
I think you're very much right. The cohesiveness of the society that got fractured in the last few years, those protests in the street, the country was really divided into 2 halves. This is terrible. And this, I'm sure, had an effect of our awareness to the single moment which the eye wasn't on the ball. Right. So cohesiveness of society, the cohesiveness of the target, it's very important, and I think Israel would learn this lesson. It's the most important lesson we learned from this event.
Certainly. So let me bring you now to the ground operations. You are in a situation where Israeli forces are on ground in Gaza. Yeah. The side at Matkal has also got an unparalleled reputation for its special operations. In terms of what's happening on ground in terms of Gaza City, the challenges are many. Because many would say, distinguishing between citizens, distinguish between terrorists, that becomes a very complicated exercise. Can you take us through in your experience, because you've also been part of these raids on Gaza in the past?
First of all, urban warfare is the hardest. I'm myself a veteran of the Lebanon War of '82, so we actually had to go in Beirut to the high-rise and those refugee camps, and it was demanding. But here there was an added element of the hostages. Because as you fight the 240 of your people somewhere in Gaza, and then you have the infrastructure of the tunnels, which really allows them to move. So we had to calculate this way. We didn't go into the campaign right away. We had to really design a plan, forces, and to go about. And right now it's the northern Gaza. The southern Gaza is where the civilians are there, and then we have to see what's next. And on top of that, we had to make sure that we don't escalate the conflict, because we have sort of a war with Hezbollah, exchange of fires all the time from the beginning, but not an escalation for a full-blown war, okay? And we have the West Bank, in which we have to arrest many Hamas operatives that try to instigate some terror. So we have a few fronts, and adding to that, there's the front of the Houthis. Those rebels from Yemen decided to shoot a few missiles that were intercepted by our defense mechanism, like the arrow. It's the first time an arrow was employed in catching a missile outside of the atmosphere. And even Shia militia in Syria. So we have 5 fronts, 3 of them heavy. Gaza, of course, the main campaign. And our main aim now is not to escalate the northern border. So we do whatever we can to answer into the Hezbollah provocation, but not escalate to a full-blown war.
There are 3, 4 important points that you've covered, and I want to go to them one by one. One is, of course, the fact that there were 240 hostages. Yeah. Now, the challenge over here, potentially, which many experts have observed, is that perhaps these hostages aren't going to be kept at the same location, unlike in Entebbe. So, does that, and how does that really complicate matters or make things more difficult for the forces who are actually engaged in trying to release these hostages?
So first of all, it was defined that we have two aims. Eliminate Hamas, the Hamas would not be the ruler of Gaza, and finding the hostages. And the two aims would have to follow up together, simultaneously. So we felt as we pushed the forces Hamas in, they would be willing either to negotiate for a deal. We are still hoping through Qatar or Egypt. On the other hand, with the brigade of the tanks and the engineers, and we had the special forces following them, looking for incident where we have a location, we have some intel about the location of some hostages, and we can follow up and rescue them. In the meantime, no success except for one woman soldier that was rescued by the special forces of the Shabak, a very good special forces. But we still have those hopes. So those are the two. This was the strategy.
Yeah, Madhav, I just have one point to make. Very essential in any conflict. Who's your enemy? Okay. Earlier, the enemy in inverted comma for the Israelis was a smaller subset. Today, this issue has blown up, especially in the Palestine. Now, the Arab rulers don't have legitimacy. Okay? They are actually, if there is a popular vote in those countries, including Saudi, there is no guarantee that this regimes will stay. Yeah. Now, the regimes are sensitive, that they don't want to do a pushback on this. Exactly. Now, your enemy or your adversary is totally different now. So you cannot do a battle strategy thinking that it is limited to Gaza or it's an Arab problem. Exactly. So exactly like Doron said, the first thing is get the situation under control, because otherwise none of the Arab countries that you have befriended now after many years can stay with you.
Do you think there's an attempt to derail that process of bringing these countries together?
Because if you look at from a Palestinian or a Hamas point, they were pinned to the wall, and if they didn't do this, they would have just been, they would have just gone into oblivion. Nobody would even have known there is somebody. So it was a last-minute, desperate attempt by them, perpetuated by a fact that there was a weak chink in the defense. They took advantage of it.
Exactly.
Okay, for their survival.
Right.
And I think the brutality is the messaging they wanted to convey.
Right. Is this also a messaging to the PLO, the Palestinian Authority also you see in this?
I think we shouldn't forget also that the PLO and Hamas, they're enemies. When Hamas was elected in Gaza, they actually executed the Palestinian Authority officials. Well, we have to get what's going on within the Palestinian society. But Tobby is explicitly, of course, is right. Don't forget that we had this Biden initiative, that the anchor was India, going to Saudi Arabia, going to Israel, going to Europe, and complementing the Abraham Accord. So this was a great plan, and I think I met soldiers a few days before the terrible war, and I said, somebody might try to derail this process. And this is what the Hamas was trying actually to do. And I hope, though the prices that will be paid are bloody, that they wouldn't succeed to derail it. And of course, the point that Tobby made about our allies. We have to forget, apart from the US and Europe, our allies in the region, Egypt, Jordan, in which we have peace accords with, and the Palestinian Authority. This is the players that in the end will have to restructure the new Middle East, and I think we have it in our mind.
Right.
I think I might add another interesting point. So we are not talking about Middle East alone. Look at the, let's say, Middle East population that has migrated to Europe. Okay, yesterday you saw Macron making a statement which is very different. He's compelled because 17% or so of his population is now people who have migrated from that area. So is it in Germany. So if something goes wrong, those countries will have problems they can't handle.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Right. When it comes to the hostages, though, I want to bring the conversation back to that. We've seen a lot of activity from a lot of Israel's allies, United States, etc., who've been visiting a number of the Middle Eastern countries. How far do you think these negotiations with, say, Iran or Qatar, which are known to have a direct line with the Hamas, how much will that help in terms of the actual release of the hostages? Iran
is not a player in this context, but Qatar for sure, because Qatar was the way also funneling money to Gaza. So Qatar is Al Jazeera. Qatar really is the players that we're trying to work out the deal is Qatar and Egypt. The head of the Mossad was in Qatar. The head of the internal security was in Egypt. So those are the two players with which you can manage some deal. The question is, of course, whether they really want to offer us an effective deal that can be executed, and it's not a way to just postpone the attack. The policy of Israel, and I support the policy, ceasefire comes with hostage deal. So if there's a hostage deal, a significant, a serious one, we will go into a ceasefire in Gaza.
Right. That's very important because, you know, on the one hand, you have a ground offensive. On the other hand, they're trying to get hostages out. There are negotiations going on for that. Are these two essentially at cross purposes, many would say? Because can we really have one and not have the other, or can the two complement each other? How do you look at it, Tobby?
I think it's not an easy situation, Madhav. But the challenge for the society of Israel and for their political leadership, it's so important to get the hostages back.
Yeah, of course.
It has to. And for the morale of the society.
The country.
Okay, because many of the top soldiers may have families there.
Yeah, of course.
So that's one point. It's non-negotiable. How do you get it when even the Qataris, who might have actually wanted to be fair in this, they are also stuck now. Because the larger emotive issue of the Arabs is at play. Now, this is the biggest challenge I feel, Doron, you are going to have now.
Yeah,
you know,
you're right.
it's about managing this whole challenge. And it is not, you can't use military to manage that challenge. It is tact, it is guile. That is why most of your Syed Matkal colleagues have an IQ, I believe, of about 160 plus.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
all of them are
It doesn't guarantee nothing, IQ.
They are all very, very clever. They are not just soldiers.
Yeah,
So
they are more than that.
The only thing is, you know, when politics gets toxic,
exactly.
you are not able to use logic there.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know,
I think Qatar, to mention, Qatar also doesn't want to lose face versus the West because of the brutality of the attack. So Qatar wants to play a role in the hostage deal. The question whether they can, whether they can execute it, whether it's real, and this is the issue. This is why we fly to Qatar. The head of the Mossad, the ex-head of the Mossad flew to Qatar.
But practically you have a problem. On the one hand, you have a government, you know, you have a democratically elected government, so on and so forth, who are responsible, who are accountable to courts and other institutions. On the other hand, you have an organization such as Hamas, who doesn't care even for its own civilians.
Yeah, for sure.
So, you know, how do you actually deal with such an organization when it comes to hostages, who we really don't know what they might do tomorrow?
I think, you know, I listened very carefully to the command of attack order of the head of the defense command, and he said, we go to war, we go to the campaign, but don't forget the values of the IDF. We are not going to sacrifice our values in terms of how the IDF operate. That's for sure. This is something that is in the core of the IDF. But of course, the difficulty persists. This is really a challenge. When I talk to those young, for me, they are young generals, I say to myself, this is a challenge we never met before, not in Beirut, not in Yom Kippur War. It's a new challenge, and Israel is facing.
But if you look at what happened in the early 2000s when it came to Gilad Shalit, that took several years. So are we past that? Is this now something that we can expect will drag on for a long time?
There's a main difference, because in the Gilad Shalit case, there was one soldier, it was hosted by one family, and everything was locked around it. There was no way to get any intel about it. But right now, everything has changed, because there's a flux of citizens, there's more human. We intercept talks. For example, when they said that we attacked a hospital at the beginning of the war, we intercept a talk between the Jihad Islamic fighter and Hamas. It turns out it's a missile, one of their missiles that failed. So we intercept talks. We have a lot of intelligence that we didn't have before. So this is the reason why we push inward to get those intel. If we get the intel, we'll get the hostages. But perhaps many of them already are smuggled to the south of Gaza, and this creates a new obstacle for us.
Right. I want to bring you back, Tobby, to a point that he made about a multi-front war. We've seen this emerge from just an Israel-Hamas war to a 2-front, 3-front, 4-front, 5-front war. And there are very real fears that this could lead to an escalation. We know how the United States carriers are there. We know how China is sending its own carriers. We've seen, of course, as you mentioned, the Houthis fire from Yemen. What's the real fear, in your view, 40 days later, about whether this will explode into a larger regional crisis or a global crisis at that? Or do you think about 40 days later, we're seeing things kind of settle down? Where's your guess on this?
My guess is it will settle down. Because everybody knows this is a no-win war. I mean, you can come from China, you can come from Russia, but if anything happens there, the world is going to suffer. Okay, every economy is going to be affected. So there are wise people in every country. Okay, I am sure everybody is now playing for their local audience to show that, like Hamas is playing to win the next election, PLO will play to win. So, but at the end, it can't be a war anymore, because I feel it is too difficult.
So what do you say to those thermonuclear war doomsdayers, if I can call them that?
I don't think so.
You don't think that's actually something that's going to happen?
See, if ever there is a thermonuclear war, it might be an accidental one, a limited one. It is not. Nobody is going to pull the trigger.
Yeah. Do you see this
I
escalating?
want to join the hopes, and I think we have to look to the front, to the Hezbollah front. It all depends there. And I think Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, also the Iranian leader, they're starting talking about the fact that they were not notified beforehand about this attack of Hamas, to show that they are not linked in this fashion to the attack, and this way it doesn't force their hand to react. So if we succeed to control Hezbollah in the north, and by some diplomacy get them a few miles away from the northern border to what we call the Litani, this is a great canyon of the Litani, then this might settle things down. But of course I don't want to predict the future. I hope it doesn't escalate to a regional conflict. It can, but I have my hopes, like Tobby.
The other thing, I was in the Middle East 2 weeks back, and I was listening to, I don't want to name some foreign ministers of Middle East. What they were saying is, I was surprised that they were harsh on the attack by the Hamas. They said it is absolutely unacceptable. But they say that they are not happy to accept a status quo, what is happening now. Okay? That the initial solution of Rabin and all, of a two-state solution, is what will retain the credibility of, let's say, the United States back there. Now, how will that be done in the little complicated political situation you have now? That's the biggest issue.
Right.
Okay? Right. Because, you know the reason. The other thing is, everybody in the region knows Israel has the nuclear bomb, and they will attack if they are pushed to the wall. Okay, then if it is a nuclear attack, nobody wins in this game.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I feel, Doron, very confident that, the might continue for a little while, because everybody is playing to win an election now.
Right.
Yeah, it might be right. I also think that the two-state solution, there's no other venue. I think the aid that we get from the U.S. means that also the U.S. say, you have to listen us right now. And I think it's true that in the current structure of the politics of Israel, when you have this very strong right-wingers supporting Netanyahu, it's hard to think of it, such an horizon. Right. But I think now the center party of Benny Gantz, my friend, who was a paratrooper with me, they might gain some momentum, and this might change towards the Rabin legacy that we all discussed.
Right. I'm going to come to Netanyahu in just a minute, because I have an interesting question to ask you on that. But I want to draw attention to what has been a growing concern 40 days hence since this crisis. Of course, we've seen both sides, the beheading of babies that Israel has spoken about, the Palestinians, the Hamas talk about how so many children, about 40% of those killed, the casualties on their side are children and babies, they say. But the larger humanitarian crisis, and there are many who are now questioning that, there was an unfortunate attack, no doubt it's highly condemnable, where 1,400 people lost their lives. But we're also looking at a situation where Palestine today says that 12,000 civilians have lost their lives over there. So there are now questions emerging about whether the response is increasingly being perceived as being disproportionate. How do you look at it?
First of all, I'm not sure about the numbers. Don't forget that 1,000 Hamas terrorists killed. I think they left like 600, 700 bodies in our border. So I'm not sure how does it go into the statistics. So I'm not sure about the numbers. For sure, to fight a war in this urban warfare, it's terrible. Nothing, of course, was intentional, and this casualties is a tragedy. I think right now we move to the stage of the war, which is more surgical. Even the move into the Shifa hospital, which was very coordinated and surgical, whatever the other people would say, means that this is the next phase of the war. Okay, and I hope there will be less casualties of civilians. In terms of the humanitarian crisis looming in the south, I think it was my position from the beginning, we should allow for the Rafah crossing in Egypt whatever humanitarian aids they need. Also, Netanyahu now allowed, of course, even oil for the generator and so on. So you have to maintain, of course, you're definitely right, you have to maintain humanitarian aid to the Palestinian civilian and hunt the Hamas. How do you do those two things?
My last question to you is, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, I don't know if many of our Indian viewers know this, but he was part of the Synergia Conclave. So how do you see him being engaged, in the day-to-day operations, or to what extent do you see him being involved in what's happening on
Okay, first of all, the unit, Synergia Conclave, on a regular basis, authorized its operation with the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. So you can be a young commander of the unit in the age of 35, and you go to the Prime Minister and I was coordinating my project with Yitzhak Rabin. It was a great honor and a great experience for me. He himself, his brother, Jonathan, was killed in the rescue operation in Entebbe in 1976. Bibi was also in the unit as a young officer, a young team commander. He didn't continue. He was even wounded in some rescue operation in the Sabena, some hijacking of an airplane that landed in Ben Gurion airport. So he knows the unit, special ops he has to authorize by definition, by law. But I think right now he has so many other scale of things to do, so I think he would let it to the Minister of Defense, who himself is a Navy SEAL guy, and to supervise the special operation forces. But of course, there's a war cabinet in which he sits. Is the chief commanding officer in the end of the whole security apparatus. This is his responsibility, and he has to do it, and I hope we'll come out from the war victorious.
Doron, Avital, Tobby, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us on this discussion.